Welcome to this special event and panel discussion on museums and peace building in a post-COVID world. My name is Natalia Siniewa-Pankowska and I'm from Poland and I'm one of the organizers of this session. We will discuss the ways in which museums can deepen and elaborate their peace building work in turbulent times. Museums can act as important partners for peace building. Our session will present inspiring, interesting and innovative examples from Europe, Africa and Asia. Our session suggests an important topic for discussion in the context of the overall conference theme, Rebuilding Trust After Disruption, and strengthens international cooperation. I would like to introduce our MC of this event, Mdun Tuli from Johannesburg, South Africa.
Firstly, we'll hear from the Peace Museum in Bradford, United Kingdom, who will tell us about their online exhibition, Peace and Pandemic, which was created during the England spring lockdown.
Hi, my name is Shannon Johnson, and I'm the Learning and Engagement Officer at the Peace Museum in Bradford in the UK. The Peace Museum is the only museum of its kind in the UK, with a unique collection of over 9,000 objects that tell the stories of peacemakers locally, nationally and internationally. Like many other places across the globe, in March 2020, the museum was impacted by the coronavirus pandemic and had to close its doors to visitors, and staff had to go and work from home. While staff were working from home, our focus was on digital delivery and engagement to make sure that our visitors and users could still be inspired by the museum's objects, but safely from their homes. However, as time went on, it became clear that the pandemic was not going to be something that would be over within a few weeks and would make a significant impact on our lives for at least the foreseeable future. It was then that the museum started to feel a responsibility to collect the stories of how the coronavirus pandemic was impacting people locally, nationally and internationally. Thus, the idea for the Peace and Pandemic exhibition was born. Peace and Pandemic is a digital exhibition that collects stories documenting people's experiences of the pandemic and has launched on our brand new website as a digital exhibition. The first section of Peace and Pandemic is dedicated to peaceful protest in lockdown, because we soon realised that whilst people were locked down from home, many were still campaigning peacefully for the things that they believed in to ensure that their messages were not lost despite the lockdown. One example of this is the campaign for nuclear disarmament and Stop the War coalition. Much of our collection covers anti-nuclear campaigns, and during the lockdown, groups like C&D and Stop the War altered and changed their message to campaigns such as #CutWarNotWelfare and #HealthcareNotWarfare. These messages are a symbol and a signal to the government to try and encourage them to stop using public funds that are then spent on nuclear weapons and other aspects of military, but instead make sure that these funds go towards supporting the NHS and welfare services, the key services that are getting people through the pandemic. Other aspects covered in the peaceful protest section of the exhibition include climate campaigners. The lockdown was another reminder of the huge impacts that we have on our environment. As people were at home, nature started to return to cities. The airs were cleaner, the sea were cleaner, and pollution was minimised. Campaign groups used this to show our human impact and called on people to make changes in their own lives to try and halt the effects of climate change. Another key section in this part of the exhibition is the Black Lives Matter movement following the murder of George Floyd in the US. The Black Lives Matter movement is not just a movement that affects the US or the UK, but affects people on a global scale. And we felt the need to document the experiences of people locally and to document how the movement was trying to progress the issues of justice and peace and human rights. We worked with a local teacher who talked to us about her experiences of being a black woman in 2020 And she also spoke to us about her decision to attend a peaceful, socially distanced protest about Black Lives Matter here in Bradford City Centre, and how she felt that it was so important that she used her voice to speak out on these ongoing issues. Another section of the Peace and Pandemic exhibition is about community spirit, and this is a section that collects people's experiences during lockdown. It has stories of joy and families coming together. It has stories of people coming together in their communities to look after the vulnerable, of people saying thank you to key workers. But it also reflects on how some of the disadvantages have been exacerbated during the crisis. Some communities have been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus crisis. This is due to a number of reasons. One of them is structural racism. So it was important that whilst community spirit shows the great efforts people have made to bring themselves together, to bring their communities together, and to get through the pandemic together, it's also another reminder that there are still people in our society who feel marginalised and cannot live in peace until those things are overcome. The final section of the exhibition looks at our collection and connects our stories in our collection to the ongoing pandemic. And in a second, I'm going to hand over to our curator to tell you a little bit more about that section. But if you want to find out more and actually see our exhibition, please visit our website, www.peacemuseum.org.uk. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Hall, curator of the Peace Museum. I'm going to talk to you about how Peace and Pandemic links to our current collections. Peace and Pandemic has allowed us to explore and reflect our collections. So we've not only managed to collect digital material, but we've managed to look back and reuse our collections in this exhibition. COVID-19 is a global pandemic, and our collection tells the stories of campaigners and peacemakers who have worked on global issues such as the Cold War and the nuclear threat. We hold a substantial amount of artefacts that relate to this anti-nuclear theme, such as objects and materials that relate to the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, or C&D, an organisation who has continued even during the pandemic to campaign for a global nuclear ban. We hold some of their original badges made in 1958 by Eric Austin. These badges are handmade, and it is shown in how they are uneven. They are not mass produced. The main feature of these badges is the C&D symbol, or as it is known by most today, the peace symbol. But we don't just hold UK collections, we hold objects and artefacts that reflect on this global theme, such as these two posters from Japan and Poland, which are again of this anti-nuclear theme. But they're striking. They don't use many words, or any words in some of them, but they use their imagery to explore this anti-nuclear theme. We even hold artefacts from the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but not just posters and campaign materials made after it happened. We hold everyday objects such as these roof tiles. This reflects the effect that this had on everyday people in Japan. And this can be seen in some of the things that have been collected, such as in community spirit, the everyday lives of people have been affected by the pandemic. We've even seen a direct link between slogans used in the 70s and 80s that have been reused today. So protest and survive, or protect and survive, has been reused in some t-shirts made by an artist that was sold today for the NHS. But these slogans were originally used in the 80s, first by the British government, so that is protect and survive. It was used on a pamphlet and poster that was sent out to the British people, which advised them on how to survive a nuclear attack. C&D in E.P. Thompson came out against this in direct action with a pamphlet and other campaign material called Protest and Survive. So today this is being used for t-shirts for the NHS, but it was used in the past. So that is a direct link, and it's great to see the slogans being used today. These are just a few examples of how our collection links to the Peace and Pandemic exhibition. We feel responsible to collect the stories and memories of people during the pandemic and contemporary collect them. But we also feel that now we need to continue to produce online and digital content to be more inclusive and allow access to our collection. So that is what we're going to do in the future. We're going to continue alongside our exhibitions to produce online content. Please go to www.peacemuseum.org.uk to have a look at the Peace and Pandemic exhibition. Thank you.
Next, we will hear from the Never Again Association. The organization was created to commemorate the Holocaust and to deal with contemporary issues of diversity and tolerance in Poland and internationally. The organization conducts educational and awareness-raising activities, including exhibitions.
Hello, my name is Natalia Siniewa-Pankowska, and I'm a representative of a Never Again Association. I'm also a Holocaust scholar and a museum educator. I'm now in this special part of the city, in Warsaw, in Poland, and this part of the city, it was a part of a Warsaw ghetto during the Second World War, and all Jews from Warsaw, but also from other areas, were forced to relocate to be to stay and live in this part of the city. Holocaust is so special, difficult, integral part of our Polish and European history. And it is so important to share our knowledge also with those living outside of Europe. And today I'm also going to share with you how our work, the work of a Never Again Association, can be relevant in other parts of the world, in non-European contexts. The Never Again Association was established in the mid-90s in Poland to commemorate, educate and build awareness about the Holocaust, and at the same time to conduct educational activities against all kinds of xenophobia and intolerance. The Holocaust targeted particularly Jews and Roma during the Second World War, but its significance is universal. Today, when there are very few Holocaust survivors left, it is very important to preserve this memory, not let it to be banalized, trivialized, or even worse, to be denied. And this is something that struck us in the Never Again Association, how we can use, how we can apply the universal lessons of the Holocaust which happened in Poland in a non-European context where there is a lack of knowledge of Holocaust history and history of the Second World War, but where there are local conflicts and genocides, for example, in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia has its own experience of the Second World War as well as other conflicts and instances of genocide. But the awareness of the Holocaust and the past atrocities is scarce, which provides fertile ground for its distortion. This is the dangerous phenomenon of Holocaust distortion. There are numerous examples of Holocaust distortion in public and media discourses in Southeast Asia. Nazi imagery can be present in popular culture, which normalizes the image of Hitler and Nazi Germany. Conspiracy theories, scapegoating minorities, and blaming the victims, including Jews, for past atrocities and historical conflicts are commonplace. The culture of memory is prone to manipulation and distortion. The dangerous phenomenon of the globalization of Holocaust denial and the rise of multi-deniers who distort both the Nazi crimes and the crimes of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, for example, have found audiences in the region. There are also examples of denial of the Holocaust and atrocities against Rohingya people in Myanmar. Never Again conducted pilot seminars on the Holocaust in Asia, in Cambodia and Thailand for local audiences, and identified some of challenges and widespread misperceptions on the subject. Our aim now is to research it further and to prevent and counter Holocaust distortion, but also to deal with local conflicts by creating joint counter strategies. The project emphasizes the sharing of good practices and strengthening international cooperation, as well as increasing the capacity of non-governmental and governmental institutions to address it. Through exchange of practices, it aims to inspire critical memory discourses in dealing with the past and the legacy of genocide, thus advancing human rights. The project aims to work at grassroots level and the audience is diverse. The project activities consist of workshops, publications, awareness raising campaigns through social media. One of the components of the project is a digital educational exhibition tackling the subject of Holocaust denial and distortion and hate speech. By visualizing the problem, we can reach a broader audience and have a bigger impact on local informational ecosystems in both countries. It also aims to help to cultivate empathy and sensitivity. The exhibition will introduce the historical overview of Holocaust denial and distortion and explore arguments and strategies to prevent and counter denial, distortion, and hate speech. It aims to deliver the following key messages. The Holocaust targeted Jews and Roma particularly, but its significance is universal. Holocaust denial is a form of genocide denial, which is dangerous and must be opposed across the world. The message is to emphasize the significance of the Holocaust as a universal heritage and a point of reference in debates on human rights. Regional and local contexts will be used to deliver the message. Holocaust denial and distortion manipulates and rejects the established facts about the Holocaust and minimizes or instrumentalizes the suffering of the victims and survivors of the atrocities perpetrated by the Nazis and their collaborators. Holocaust denial and distortion is a form of hate speech which precludes the dehumanization of victims and is used to justify discrimination and other acts of violence against minorities and other groups. The project is an interesting example of how we can translate our Polish European experience and lessons into different contexts and draw attention to other atrocities and violence. To counter denying past atrocities and genocides is an important part of peace work, which has to be done by museums in partnerships with such organizations as the Never Again Association and the governments. Long-term outcomes of our project include a more tolerant, open-minded, and historically conscious society, an increased awareness of the Holocaust and the legacy of the Second World War, as well as other conflicts and instances of genocide in Southeast Asia, enhancing the culture of peace and human rights in the region.
Lastly, we will hear from the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. The center honors the memory of the victims of genocide in the 20th century and teaches about the consequences of prejudice and hate speech so as to prevent the recurrence of mass atrocities and genocide in all its forms.
Welcome to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. A place of learning, a place of memory. Its walls and spaces full of symbolism.
Often, when working towards building and cultivating a culture of peace, we are compelled to confront painful histories of atrocities and dangerous and harmful ideologies that create a culture of violence and othering, which may lead to further human rights abuses and genocide. Through our education and public programs, the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center uses the histories of the Holocaust and the 1994 genocide in Rwanda as case studies to cultivate peace and encourage our public to make connections to today and the dangers of apathy and othering. By examining our own conditioned minds, we can interrogate our sense of identity and perhaps begin the process of unlearning harmful ideologies and prejudices and accept and embrace the uniqueness and freedom of ourselves and others. The memories of the history of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda are painful and disturbing, but also offer us an opportunity to examine the choices that people made during and after these atrocities in order to bring peace to the present. Often by encouraging our visitors to empathize with persecuted communities and individuals, we create a process of human connection, and we are able to connect to individuals from different communities. In our permanent exhibition, we have numerous stories, tragic but also inspiring ones, of individuals that exemplify and demonstrate the power of empathy. The story of Xavier Ngabo and the students from the St. Stephen's Girls' College in Johannesburg is one that stands out.
In 2009, as a grade 8 learner at St. Stephen's Girls' College, my classmates and I had the privilege of meeting Xavier Ngabo and hearing his tragic account of what had happened to him during the genocide in Rwanda. For a period, Xavier lived in Johannesburg, where he volunteered at the Johannesburg Holocaust&Genocide Center. Xavier had lost his entire family before and during the genocide. Many survivors have the need to figure out how their family members died, to retrieve their remains and give them a dignified burial. During his account to us, Xavier expressed how he too wished to figure out what happened to his family.
Our grade of girls were compassionate individuals who felt strongly about finding some way to help Xavier and to honor his family. We made it our mission to help raise funds for him to find out what happened, just as he had expressed to us. And later in 2009, Xavier returned home. There, he uncovered the fate of his parents through the Gacaca courts. When Xavier located and exhumed his mother's remains, she was still wearing her rosary and holding the key to her home.
On the 9th of May 2010, Beatrice and Edouard's remains were buried together in one coffin at the Mukamira Memorial Site. I felt so proud at that moment to know that as a group of grade 8s, only 14 years old, we had made such a difference in somebody else's life and had helped Xavier in his healing process.
This was a true demonstration of human connection between South African teenage girls and a man who had survived a horrific genocide.
At the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre, we understand that peace is not merely the absence of violence, but that it must also be the absence of social structures and belief systems that limit the freedoms of certain groups within our society. And we know from history that whether these groups are defined by skin color, by nationality, by sexual orientation, or by religion, the prejudice towards and othering of these groups are the potential seeds of violence. And so we use education to equip learners and visitors with attitudes and knowledge and critical thinking skills that we believe are pro-peace. And we ask everybody who visits us to become active voices within their own communities. In our permanent exhibition, we have many artifacts and objects that create tangible links to pasts that can otherwise feel quite distant and disconnected to our own lives. Objects document the history of ordinary people who lived through extraordinary times. They tell us about their occupations, their hobbies, their hopes and struggles, moving us away from statistics associated with genocide and war, and allowing us to connect to the people behind these numbers. We use objects to analyze the difference between facts, opinions, and assumptions, to extend and develop our knowledge, and to encourage learners to articulate and share ideas and listen to those of others. One such object is this violin that was made in 1792 in Czechoslovakia, the story of how it was looted, recovered, gifted, and found its way to Johannesburg, and especially what it meant to its last owner, Cecilia Borochovitz, is one of resistance and resilience during the Holocaust. Cecilia grew up in a musical family with loving parents. She had a happy, active life studying and playing the violin. With the Nazi invasion of Latvia in June and July 1941, Cecilia and her sister were separated from their parents, who were murdered. The sisters later moved into the Vilna ghetto, and Cecilia worked in the hospital as a cleaner and joined the ghetto's symphony orchestra, playing in the evenings to people who returned from work, exhausted and hungry. After liberation, Cecilia and her sister moved to Rome, where Cecilia was given this violin, recovered by American forces from amongst looted valuables taken by the Nazis from Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. This gift made it possible for her to continue her study of the violin, and when she moved to South Africa in 1949, she played with the Johannesburg Philharmonic Orchestra for many years. Cecilia kept the violin until she died in September 2015 at the age of 91. Cecilia's violin provokes discussion around everyday acts of resistance that do not involve weapons and physical fighting. We can understand that cultural and creative expression amid the harsh conditions of the ghetto really defied Nazis' attempts at alienation and dehumanization of the Jews. Stories like this and many other in our exhibition space really help us to understand the human responses to the horrors of the Holocaust, and we use it to inspire visitors to commit changes in their own lives and in their own communities. We encourage people to record their commitments on paper as part of the Butterfly Project, so that their voices and ideas become an important part of our exhibition space.
I'm going to look at some choices that were made using a personal story. Romeo Dallaire, the Canadian Lieutenant General who was in charge of the United Nations peacekeeping force in Rwanda, who chose to stay after most of the troops and expats had left, is quoted as saying, "Mass violence and genocide do not occur by accident. They are caused by human will, and they can be prevented by human will." He seems to be implying that there are choices to be made. And in order for there to be peace, we need to make the right choices. I would like to introduce you to Damas Gizimba, who was the director of an orphanage in Kigali that had the capacity for 60 children. But he made a choice to hide and shelter 400 people. He had taught the children that they were all Rwandans, so that when the militias came and tried to divide them into two groups, a Hutu and a Tutsi group, they refused. Carl Wilkins, who was the only American that made the choice to stay behind, was the director of the Rwandan Adventist Development and Relief Agency International. When the militias did surround the orphanage and were preparing to attack and kill them all, Wilkins pleaded with the Rwandan Prime Minister, who was responsible for the genocide, to help save these children. Thanks to the brave choices of these two men, many Tutsi were saved. Using the stories of these two men who made choices that saved many people, we are able to grow an awareness of how important it is to make choices that will lead to peace and not to conflict. And when the killing stopped, there were over 800,000 Tutsi and some politically moderate Hutu who were dead. How could the people of Rwanda ever overcome such hatred? In 1996, a mere 2 years later, when thousands of families began to return to the villages, the slow process of reconciliation began. There could not be one Rwanda for the victims and another Rwanda for the perpetrators. There could only be one Rwanda. And so the people had to make the choice of reconciliation so that they could move forward towards peace.
Peace is a choice. Activism is a choice. Not only individuals make choices that are often difficult choices, but also governments make choices that often change the trajectory of the lives of their citizens. In April 1994, when South Africans were celebrating their freedom from apartheid, standing proudly in queues for hours to vote in the nation's first democratic elections, only a mere 3.5 hours flight away, in the same continent, In the same time, in Rwanda, hundreds of thousands of Tutsi and politically moderate Hutu were murdered during a period of 3 months. This education work that we do at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center goes beyond South Africa. Through partnerships with other human rights organizations that aim to build peace, we envision a culture of peace throughout our continent. The Change Makers program is a youth leadership program that confronts extremism and extremist ideologies, such as those of racism and other extreme forms of othering, in order to cultivate a culture of pluralism and peace. Having been conducted in 12 African countries since its inception in 2016, this initiative proves once again that education is a powerful tool to cultivate youth leaders that are centered in a vision of peaceful and fair leadership in our country and in our continent. All humans are human, or are some more human than others. This should make all of us understand how critical it is to treat everybody equally in order to build and cultivate a culture of peace. Welcome to this special event and panel discussion on museums and peace building in a post-COVID world. My name is Mdunduli, and I'm the MC or the interlocutor of this session. I would just like to introduce the panelists. So firstly, we have Charlotte Hall, and we have Shannon Johnson, we have Tali Nates, and we have Natalia Sinyaneva Penkoska. So I'll start with Charlotte. Hello, Charlotte.
Hi, I'm the curator at the Peace Museum in Bradford, and we're the only peace museum right now in the United Kingdom.
Thank you. And then I'll go to Shannon. Shannon, hello.
Yes, hello. So I'm the Learning and Engagement Officer at the Peace Museum in Bradford in the UK alongside Charlotte.
Thank you. And then over to Tali Nates.
Hi, I'm the founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center here in South Africa.
And then finally, we have Natalia Sinyaneva Penkoska.
Thank you very much. I'm Natalia Sinyaneva Penkoska, and I'm from the Never Again Association from Poland.
All right, thank you very much for introducing yourselves. And my first question is, how can museums go beyond collecting the stories of peace to dealing with contemporary challenges and undertaking peace building work? Very difficult question, and I'll start with Charlotte.
So from my point of view as a curator, I think we still need to continue collecting those stories, but especially how people are living post-COVID. So right now we've been focusing on like how people live in lockdown, but you know, we also need to think about how people continue after lockdown, after COVID has passed, what their experiences are when we get back to the, say, new normal as well. But take what we've learned from the stories and maybe help people get jobs, share information, anything we can do to help the communities in Bradford is really important to us.
Absolutely. And then Shannon, what would you like to say?
So I think adding on to that, I think our role as the only peace museum in the UK, my role is about education. And I think education is a really fantastic way that museums can help peace building. We already do this kind of before COVID, but even now we could argue it's even more important that we're teaching children to be inspired by the peacemakers of the past and the present. So they're the peacemakers of the future. So they kind of have the skills to be equipped to deal with conflict, to deal with it in a peaceful way. And I think especially here in the UK and obviously globally as well, the pandemic has highlighted that there are still structural differences and people are disproportionately affected within society. And we all need to work together to overcome that so we can all live in a peaceful world. So I think education is a really crucial element of us moving into the post-COVID world, of how we can make a difference to peace building.
Absolutely. Education is very powerful. And so now I'll go to Tali. Tali, what would you like to say?
I think for us in South Africa, and you also work at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, if we look at our museum, but generally at museums work is much more around issues of human rights and making connections to human rights. And human rights will be different focus in different societies. For us in South Africa, issues of racism, issues of gender-based violence, issues around xenophobia and Afrophobia are our biggest challenges. And COVID-19, I think, exposed some of them even more. So we need to make a connection between what we are teaching about genocide, about the Holocaust, about Rwanda, and make connections to today's world and today's challenges, and try to create activism in our community. And we are working a lot with memory activism, basically looking at memory and connecting it to issues of today, and encouraging our communities to become activists, upstanders, change makers. And I think that we need to do it now during COVID-19, but also beyond the pandemic.
Absolutely. And also empathy. I think this is an incredible time for us to exercise empathy towards one another. And so with that, I'll go to Natalia. Natalia, what would you like to say?
I think that museums have huge potential to confront and challenge difficult knowledge about the war or other atrocities, give space. Space is very important to bring diverse audiences together, to bring competing victims together, to confront difficult past, to reconcile, to have an opportunity to reflect on it. And also museums have potential to help communities affected by trauma or by the pandemic to build resilience through their exhibitional activities, curatorial choices, interactivity, sounds, interactive guided tours, cultural program, educational programs, stories, online or in person. So we had this huge potential, and they can also build solidarity, and they can also build resistance to contemporary injustice, to ongoing atrocities. So the role of museum is very important. And I also think that partnerships, cooperation is very important with other organizations, peacebuilding organizations, and it will have to reach out to wider audience, but also to find out new audience and to build up a stronger response to the challenges we are facing today.
Absolutely, Natalia. And I think often people think of museums as dead or historical or old spaces, but actually museums can be alive and dynamic spaces. And this brings me to my next question. How can museums be a safe space for dialogue about pressing contemporary issues in the context of COVID-19? So with that question, I'll go to you again, Charlotte. What do you think about this question?
I think for us as the Peace Museum, we have really started to make our museum a safe space for dialogue. We do it through co-curation, so our exhibitions, we try and get involved with the communities what the exhibition is about. If they're coming to help us write the panels, or if they bring objects in, they write their own labels. We try and let them have as much free dialogue as they can in that sense. In other senses, even just letting them use the museum buildings as a free, safe space is great whenever they need it. And I also think that we need to be flexible, and after COVID-19 still think about the virtual things we can do, especially for audience that might still be struggling to maybe leave the house or you know, get themselves back in society. And I also think thinking about the mental well-being of not just communities but the staff, everyone who works for you too, is really important post COVID-19.
And Shannon?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Charlotte said. And in our education programme, one of the remits is to allow pupils and young people a space where they can discuss really quite difficult topics. As we all know, we all work with sensitive and difficult topics around war and conflict and genocide. And it's about allowing pupils to have that space to think about them, to ask questions. And I see that as my role. A teacher in a classroom might not necessarily be a historical expert and who can't answer some of these quite difficult questions. So I kind of see the Peace Museum as being that expert and being able to answer those questions and allow them to have the thought to think about these things and not just see it as historical, but also to use history as a way to kind of examine our world now. And you know, as the name of Natalia's organisation, as a message of never again. I think is really, really important. So yeah, I definitely agree that museums have and need to be a safe space for dialogue, and even more so in the kind of post-COVID-19 context as well.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think COVID-19 and all the lockdowns that we've experienced have really exposed inequalities in our societies. And so for us to make never again, it requires dialogue. And so Tali, I'll come to you. What do you think?
I think that it was a huge challenge for us as museums to move very quickly and think about all our visitors, all our audiences, and think about how do you create a safe space? What is a safe space? So what happens in a world, as you said, with inequalities, where not everyone has access to the internet? What happens to our learners, students that used to come to our museums, that it is a museum free of charge, so we never charge them to come to the museum, but now they're in lockdown. How do we get to those people that are still at home and they do want to network, they do want to learn, they do want to connect to others? So during the lockdowns, it was a lot of thinking about what do we do? How do we not just translate a physical visit to a museum into an exciting, innovative way, but inclusive way of not only involving people on Zoom if they don't have Zoom or they don't have data, but how do you do it on WhatsApp? How do you do it on audio files? How do you do it to rural communities? So a safe space is for everyone. And now that we are reopening, and it's quite exciting to see the center full of visitors and schools and students, and people are missing the face-to-face connection. People are missing that physical being in a space to learn. And now it is all about the hybrid. How do we create a place that continues to innovate and use, you know, the format of the online in whatever format it is, and the face-to-face. And I think do things like the Butterfly project that we did, that creates a platform, create a butterfly, write a message. We did it, for example, for survivors, Holocaust survivors, survivors from Rwanda, but connecting between children and survivors. And that can be done not only face-to-face, but also in that hybrid connection that I'm talking about.
Absolutely. We've had to be very innovative during this time, absolutely. And then Natalia, what would you like to say?
We are facing many challenges due to the pandemic, and we have mentioned it: growing hate, violence, xenophobia, inequalities, discrimination against various groups. And these are not new challenges, but they were deepened during this crisis. And of course, museums were affected because of the pandemic, and they look for new forms, new ways, solutions to work with the audiences online. But at the same time, we also have this potential and position to use the resources to tackle these problems in different ways, through educational programs, through cultural programs, and they also have this opportunity to address contemporary societal problems through the reference to history, to past atrocities, pandemics from history, and relate to nowadays problems. And as it has been mentioned, inclusivity. museums can engage various communities. So it's very important to be inclusive and include also marginalized groups such as minorities, refugees, migrants, women, to include them as visitors, but also as participants of online programs, but also as volunteers or program implementers in very different ways. And they may develop additional e-learning programs, for example, for most discriminated groups now, also during the pandemic, like the older people who are isolated during the pandemic. So to be as inclusive as possible, I think it's very important to do for museums today.
Yes, and also, you know, building a culture of peace is not easy, but as you said, Natalia, sometimes it requires partnerships. Like, for example, this panel discussion, all of us are from different countries and different organizations, but we're partnering to find a solution and to find a way to build a culture of peace. So in conclusion, any last words that you would like to share with us? Charlotte, I'll start with you. Any last words?
I think inclusion is the thing we can take away. It's getting as many people, as many communities involved as possible, and helping people.
Thank you. Thank you. And then Shannon, any last words?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that's been said. I think the pandemic has been another stark reminder of the differences, but it's also been another reminder that there are lots of different organisations and groups across the world who do want to make a difference to people's communities and to build a more peaceful world. And it's our responsibility to connect and to keep going, and hopefully, you know, we can all build towards that future.
Wow, thank you. And then Tali, any last words from you?
Yeah, again, agree very much with this wonderful partnership that was put together around the world. And I think that we need to see this as an opportunity and see the silver lining in COVID-19, to see that it allowed us to reach globally and create a lot of strong connections around the world with and develop new ideas that maybe if without COVID-19, we would not have been pushed, quite brutally pushed, to think outside the box and innovate, and that is a blessing.
Absolutely. And I think many people never thought that we would have a situation like this, but this is, as you said, Tali, it's an opportunity and a reminder of how connected we are as a human species. Natalia, last word.
I think cooperation is very important, and cooperation and solidarity. And what we are doing today is also our joint work, and we are learning from each other, sharing our experiences, and also bring it to a broader audience. And I think it's just the beginning of our this kind of cooperation, which we can deepen and elaborate in the future and share with others.
Wow. Thank you very much for being part of this panel discussion, and all the best, and keep well and safe during this time. Thank you very much.